when you talk about a subject like this, brands and future, I think at one level, I find it a very difficult subject to speak about, not because there isn't enough to say, but because there is too much to say, and most of it has already been said. A lot of it eloquently in what Rajesh just put up. But otherwise also, this is a story, at one level, we all know this particular story. We've heard this story. For the last 2 years or 5 years, we've had it coming out of our ears. Everyone knows, what to say, what to talk about, and how to sort of, the words have, and the adjectives and the descriptors are all in place. And so, engagement and, brands have to seat control, and it's about acting and not speaking, and it must be purpose-driven. And there's collaboration, and there's crowdsourcing, and there's co-creation, and it's belief-led, it's advocacy, community building. We know this story. It's a conversation, it's not a one-way dialogue. And that's the reason why if you stop there, and if you just talk about that, it's truly, I think it's wasting your time. And therefore, I'm going to do something that is of interest to me, which is really to get behind this. And then look at this question and look at some of the larger underlying themes. And considering this is a keynote, considering this is the first sort of a session in this conference, I can take the liberty, if you like, of striking a conceptual note and allowing the rest of the conference to sort of act it out and give you more tangible, concrete kind of examples that will perhaps illustrate what I am saying. My thesis, in a sense, is that for all the thrall with which we hold and we behold change, we tend to underestimate its sweeping power. And that might seem a bit strange to say that, considering that, there is almost this aura and this seductive aura around the idea of change. And we are in love with the idea of change, and we keep kind of parroting the idea that, the world is changing, this is, epochal in some times. And yet, I would still argue that you take away the hype that surrounds that idea and look at its substance, then perhaps the power of that change and the extent of that change is perhaps not being fully recognized. The digital world and social media are not media evolutions, but social revolutions. And to me, this is a central tenet of trying to grasp what is happening in the world today, which is the fact that the moment we think of these as media platforms, and we think of this as a new media platform that unlocks new opportunities, it is to, in a sense, narrow substantially the significance, the meaning, the power, the sweep of what we are seeing. What is happening in this transition to a digital mode, I think is much more significant. We are already beginning to see some effects of this revolution, and this is just the beginning. The world of brands is deeply rooted in the assumptions of an earlier time and resists attempts at fundamental change. And over the last time that I was here at this conference to now, there has already been a substantial change in the attitude of brands and the way that they engage with the world of new media, of social media. But even so, at a fundamental level, I'm arguing that the world of brands and the way that it is constructed, the world of business, the way its founding assumptions are such that for it to embrace this new way of thinking, new way of seeing the world is exceedingly difficult, and it is resisted in many, many different ways. And that the brands of the future will need to be evolved around a new mental model of what are brands, not just of themselves, but the world they live in. And it is, in a sense, a reimagining. It will not happen overnight. It is early days, but what we are seeing is the beginnings of a process of reimagining the world we live in, reimagining the notion of business itself, and within that, what brands mean and what they can deliver to us in our lives. So therefore, what I'm attempting to do, is a kind of a deeper exploration. In a sense, the mode being followed is to look at stuff that is familiar, stuff we've taken for granted, media, brands, to make the familiar unfamiliar, and to see it as if it were a strange being, and then to try and make it familiar again. The first process of making the familiar unfamiliar, to my mind, aids understanding. And the second process of refamiliarizing it perhaps aids the process of insight. And this is one way in which we can sort of grasp the world in a new way. The danger with the familiar, the physicist and philosopher David Bohm, gives an example of he argues as to why is it that it took Newton to figure out gravity? Why did we not ask the question that, Asterix and company seem to ask all the time that, why doesn't the sky fall on our heads? Why don't the stars fall? What is holding them up? And he argues that part of the reason is the fact is that we call them celestial objects. And the moment we call them celestial objects, we kind of foreclosed the curiosity and the question because they belong to the sky. And by definition, it was not worth asking as to why do they belong to the sky? Why do they not fall like anything else that we see around us? And therefore, the familiar and this becomes the stale. And it needs, in some ways, to be made unfamiliar. And therefore, a look at what are the key underlying drivers of change and to look at each of these in perhaps a slightly new way. To my mind, the most important, the most, sweeping kind of a force that we are seeing today is the change in a dominant media form. And when media changes, and I would argue everything changes, it helps everything change. It is not the only force, it's not the only factor that determines change, but it is a fundamental factor, and its power tends to be underestimated. Why is media so central? What is media? When you say what is a medium? What is a medium? A medium is what in some ways is a technology that immortalizes the mind and its output. If you like, take the book as an idea. Take the written word and the book. What does the book do? The book takes the product of our mind, thought, and places it, stores it. It can be retrieved, it can be recirculated, it can provide velocity to new ideas. Beginning with the spoken word, when we learned language, man is the one animal that has used language. Marshall McLuhan argues that the spoken word was the first technology where man learned to detach himself, let go of the environment in order to grasp it in a new way. That power, that's what media does. So whether it's television, whether it's the digital world, these are places, otherwise our thoughts are embedded inside us. This is where we place our thoughts. And we allow these thoughts to influence other people, other generations. And the power of media is therefore transformational. How a medium interacts with these thoughts, recombines them, and feeds them back to us is a fundamental determinant of how we see the world. This is what allows for storage, transmission, and multiplication of ideas. And McLuhan goes on to say, among many other things, that we become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. That's the power of technology, the power of media. We create media, we create that technology, but in imperceptible ways, then what we create ends up shaping and reshaping us. And that's what we are seeing. So when dominant media change, they help everything else change. So if you look at the time when the world was dominated by the spoken word in oral societies, you find that the dominant codes there are emotion, participation, unity. When we speak, for instance, when I'm speaking, I make hand gestures. If you were to record what I said, you will find that it is not grammatically correct. When I write, writing is a retrospective act. We write with logic. It's sequential. It is detached. Emotion is withdrawn. When we speak, we are in the moment. Oral societies, in a sense, you will find the idea of not being able to detach yourself from the world of ritual, the world of mystery, the world of storytelling, community. This is the world that comes when the spoken word is the dominant form. In print is when you find memory, separation, logic. A great way of looking at this, I find, is when you look at the structure of Indian cities. You look at Bangalore from the air, you will not find a straight line. The city in India is like a whispered conversation. Somebody leans over to somebody, somebody taps somebody, and sort of the houses and streets are organically formed. You look at Europe, any of the great European cities from the air, and it's like a symphonic construction. And you will see symmetry, you will see order. It's the product of a single eye. And that's what the oral, when you move from oral to phonetic or print cultures, you find this movement from sound to sight as being the primary sense. And with television, we see something else. We see transience, we see desire. We want something. Remote controls give us the power. At any given point in time, Rakhi Swavant is a click away. God help us. And therefore we become immersed, we get drawn in. Consumption, in a sense, is enabled by the coming of a technology like television. And similarly, therefore, when you have the advent of the digital world, what it is bringing forward is not simply a new medium, new opportunities, but it is bringing to us a new way of combining these different senses. So the digital mode there would be 100 ways of describing it, but it's like individual minds connected and multiplied now, and the nowness is a very important part. And which is why, we know all this. It's democratic, it is collaborative, it's connected, it's simultaneous. Theorist Walter Ong calls it, the secondary orality. What he says is like, it is a wonderful thing which combines all the power of the written word and the spoken word, which is why we are seeing the return, if you like, of text. We are writing and reading in some ways much more. And simultaneously, there's community, there's participation. In oral societies, there is no authorship and ownership of text. Folk stories are not owned by people. They're not written by an individual. Folk songs, we don't know who wrote them. They've been part of a collective tradition. They are part of community ownership. And we find the same pattern being repeated here. On the internet, it's increasingly difficult to figure out who wrote what. You look at the open source movement and the idea of boundaries around ownership of ideas, you find that those boundaries are receding. And therefore, what we are seeing is a fundamental form of reorganization of the mind, and therefore the consequences of that. The other thing that we are seeing is the increasing focus on the mind. One way to look at the internet is as the playground of the mind. It's interesting that if you look at how the body has moved, the importance of the body has actually become less and less as I find it really curious when we talk about going for a walk in order to keep our body from rotting from disuse. Because that's what we are doing. We take our body for a walk. We go to the gym in order to exercise this machine called the body, because otherwise, with disuse, it will fall apart. So therefore, we are exercising it deliberately, self-consciously, which would be a joke to a woman who has to walk 10 kilometers to collect firewood, in parts of India, or to get water. But to a large part of the world, increasingly the body is almost, to exaggerate a little, a vestigial organ, to be used for entertainment, to be sculpted, to be shaped, to admire. We now shape our body and admire it in the mirror. The idea of building and converting into an act, which is, an artifact on display. Along with that, but the mind, on the other hand, we are finding more and more uses for. It's a complementary virtual world that we are creating in the image of the mind and with its own codes. The new source of wealth and value creation in the world is increasingly our ideas. The original source of wealth in the world was human labor. Then it moved to capital. And then finally, increasingly what we are seeing is that the source of wealth in the world is ideas. So you moved from the product of the body increasingly towards the product of the mind. And that's a fundamental shift. That's the second big shift that is taking place. And the third big shift that is taking place is the shift in the balance of power. From Western industrialized economies that have dominated the world, increasingly the balance of power shifting, and that will continue to shift in the next 50 years. Which means there are new imaginations, new vocabularies, new ways of seeing the world, complex cultural flows that are taking place. There's the much ballyhooed Kolaveri D phenomenon in a sense. But where you find that the flow is no longer just in one direction, and it is taking on interesting, complex hybrid forms. The big fault line in the world today is this, that there is this decentralizing, democratizing pull of media and technology versus the centralizing grip of power structures. This is the central debate that you will find, whether it is in the political system, decentralizing, states versus center. You find this structure repeating in the question of governments, corporations, how do corporations centralize? Questions about net neutrality, for instance. How do, again, the desire for power to aggregate, centralize, versus the pull, if you like, to democratize. Brands similarly face the same. Brands have historically always collected, centralized, their focus. They are seen as kind of fortresses from which, there are very guarded interactions that take place with consumers. And now there is this pull which is the social media sort of represents that best, which is scattering that power. And this is the push and pull that we are seeing being played out in so many parts of our lives. The brand disconnect. So if this is the context, what are the implications for brands? The problem with brands as they stand today is that they're imagined as a centrally controlled transmission. And for all the talk and the attempt to loosen this, it's difficult to do so. Because they've had historically the ability to make people listen and act. That's a power that's not easy to let go of. The power of scale. The power, and which is the amazing thing about the internet, is that it is, to the extent possible, scale neutral. Nobody can, through the power of money, dominate the internet if I do not. It is still my choice whether I want to go there or not. Unlike television, where you can intrude into my consciousness and force yourself into my life, you cannot do so anymore. This is an exceedingly difficult thing to grasp, to accept, and to act upon. In fact, traditionally, and last year I used the words that, which was perhaps an overstatement, but I would still say it is largely true. I said that brands hate people. And but I could sort of modify to say that their brands are allergic to people, or brands are, they tolerate people, or they tolerate consumers. And you find that in 100 different ways, You look at telecom companies. Not a sponsor, right? It's interesting. You forget everything else. All of us have service issues. But just take this whole thing about the fact that, you get all the spamming and all the messages that we've got. It does not take rocket science. It did not take any consumer research for them to know that this is something consumers don't like. I mean, it is about as obvious as anything in the world that, people hate this. And yet, it takes regulatory authorities to step in. Even then, it is not, in spite of allegedly everything having been put in place, we still get that spam. It still comes to us from corporations that are listed, and corporations which have in their conference rooms all the lofty mission statements that we are all familiar with. What is this disconnect? What is the problem about brands being able to, in this one area where this is the case, where this is not a mystery to you, and all your lofty claims, what happens to them? Because fundamentally, this unease with having to listening on your own terms is easy. Listening on somebody else's terms is not easy. And therefore, the more you tell yourself that I must listen, the more you are saying that I'm programmed not to. What of the brands of the future? If this is in some ways the world that is coming, and this is a fundamental issue that brands face, some of the things that come to mind in terms of, what we are likely to see is that the mental model of the brand today is like a pond. It's like with given fixed boundaries, which you guard and which you refresh occasionally, but otherwise it's something that you own. There are boundaries. Increasingly, the mental model of brands is likely to be that of rivers, which have a source into which many tributaries flow, and which is not bounded. It can have an occasional change of course. It is not soiled by contamination or criticism. The river, if you look at, Heraclitus said that, you will never step into the same river twice. Similarly, you never interact with the same brand twice. The brand is an open system that is being modified every day by consumer interactions. Every time I interact with the brand, I change it a little bit. And yet, like the river stays the river. The Ganga is the Ganga. The Ganga can have dead bodies floating in it. The Gangas can have, various tributaries flowing into it. The Ganga changes course occasionally. It has been, but through millennia, the brand is the brand. You can have various changes, you can update it, you can criticize it, but it lives among the people and is an organic part of our lives. That is the role of brands. Brands are not artificial constructions. To imagine brands increasingly in the future, to see them as, because that's what has happened. You know, you can think about the 20th century as a giant training program where we took human beings and converted them into consumers. It's a form of, you know, training mechanism that has taken place. Now the consumers want to have intelligent, sophisticated conversations with brands. Now they want to be part of the story of the brands. They are no longer outside, they are not you cannot infantilize them. You cannot talk down and tell them your little favorite 2 stories that you have culled out. And through press releases, you will feed them a certain patter. You can't do that anymore. And this open system view of brands is exceedingly difficult to embrace, but that is the brand of the future. And as a corollary, therefore, you know, a lot of people say this, that the brand belongs to the consumer, but that nobody believes that. But you are being forced out of the comfort of being able to live out that hypocrisy of not believing in the fact that it is indeed owned by the community, because, you know, you see it it is outside your control today. It can happen, as it did in the case that Rajesh pointed out of Maggie. It's not as if, therefore, that only means that people have bad things. People have, if you are a good brand, you played a role. If you are confident that you have played a role in the lives of people, people will talk about you with the same fondness. You are a part of their lives, as we saw a wonderful example of. But it is owned by the community. Maggie is owned by all of us. We have grown up eating it, remembering it. We have nostalgic stories about it. So increasingly, that idea that it is owned by community and not by company, I think, is becoming a reality. And therefore, the key role, therefore, of the corporation or the company becomes not to manage a brand, but to be managed by a brand. Increasingly, what we need to do is to listen to the story of the brand and be led by it. We are part of this. We are telling the story of the brand that, in a sense, has been, in its fundamental essence, has been scripted and is being reimagined. Like any oral tradition, in the retelling of a story, you contemporize the story. You take the context on board. Any oral tradition, when it retells stories, that's the reason why you have thousands of Ramayans in our country. You don't have only one Ramayana. There isn't, and in a similar sense, how even if you look at the most sort of, what seem to be the most tightly managed brands in the world, if you look at a brand like Apple, for instance, you could argue that, Tim Cook's role is to be managed by the brand. His role is not in that sense to run the brand, but to be run by the brand. And that leads to an interesting, if you push that a little, that, the old notion of brand building, which also is linked to the physical world, just the word building is concrete, it's construction, it's brick and mortar. You build something, which has shape and form. You could argue that the role increasingly is to dissolve the brand. It's like making the water salty, so that every sip of water has salt in it. Every sip of your interaction with the brand has the brand in it. It's when you are able to scatter the brand, so that anybody who comes into contact with the brand becomes a spokesperson for the brand. Because increasingly in a world where there are so many people talking about the brand, you cannot have a central mechanism that deals with all of them. You cannot have one headquarters that says, how do I handle queries? How do I react to and respond to things that are happening across the world? You have to let go. When letting go means, in some ways, the power of dissolving the brand in the lives of the people, rather than building the brand and separating it and making it as a concrete, which is the reason, if you look at even how traditionally brand managers, if they're at a press conference, when they hold up, they will hold up, packs like this, consumers in an ad, so that, the crinkle is not shown. And so it's that, to me, it represents this idea that this is a separate, inorganic being. It's not a part of my life. I don't deal with packets like that. I scrunch them up, but by keeping the pristineness of the brand in your mind, in some ways what you're doing is denying ownership of the brand to the people who use it. And the other imperative increasingly is to create a meaning surplus. As we move into the world of the mind, the world of ideas, the world of increasingly into a virtualized arena, which is a separate arena from the physical world, the idea of how do we stuff more idea per square inch of thing, if you like. Increasingly, how can more meaning, because one way of looking at marketing, in fact, my definition of marketing is marketing makes meaning that is valuable to people. All that marketing does is it makes meaning. A bottle of cola versus Coke, the difference is meaning, is the meaning surplus that you create. And increasingly the imperative to create meaning through the telling myths, telling stories, giving people stories to tell, being a part of their lives is increasingly more important. And in fact, in the whole question of sustainability, the idea which is another big pressure in today's times, the wonderful opportunities for brands to be devices that are meaning rich and resource poor. To illustrate what I mean by that, I'm talking, take the Rakhi, as an idea. Look at it, the simplest Rakhi is a string, a white string with a little white sort of a flower-like thing, that is a Rakhi. The smallest, look at the meaning that you have stuffed. Resource poor, one string, meaning rich, redolent with meaning. The idea, where you have these films where in a dacoit somebody ties a Rakhi and, you look at the power of that symbol. That is the power of brands. The power of brands is to stuff more meaning per square inch of thing. The power of the brand in a world that is concerned with sustainability is increasingly to say what we are looking for is meaning. We are buying meaning in the guise of things. Why are we using so many things? Why can marketing not be about creating that meaning and creating powerful meaning using as little resource as possible? To me, this is a real challenge, a real opportunity for brands. And I think imagining brands in the virtual space allows us to imagine this much more freely. You look at the new brands of the world, you'll find that in so many ways they are resource poor, meaning rich brands. And it's a wonderful and truly kind of an opportune moment for brands to step up and play this role. Increasingly, because of the importance of the virtual world, therefore, simultaneous seamless existence in physical and virtual spaces. Not to see the virtual space as an entry or a media platform, but to actually see simultaneous existence. And to say that, and therefore, both in terms of revenue, both in terms of presence and visibility, it's almost like this is a new inhabitation that has been populated. Imagine it as a new world that has been created. So therefore, when people ask too many questions about ROI or ask too many, my reaction always is, this is early days, you get there in first. This is not the time to use measurement sort of logic too early in the game. You have to play it. You cannot afford to stand on the outside and be fastidious at this point in time. Learn to play the game. Make mistakes, but you cannot afford not to be part of this world. And increasingly, therefore, we are coming to a point where brands are, used to be masks that cannot be penetrated. We are a mask. We speak to you through a programmed in a programmed way. Increasingly, the brand is a truth that cannot hide. Increasingly, and the desire to hide is a problem. It's the desire to engage. It's desire is to bring down the boundaries and to find meaning and pleasure and purpose in that interaction, through that interaction, to imagine, therefore, the community as being the central part of the brand. It's only then that you find that brands of future have genuine meaning. So the brand of tomorrow, to sort of bring this to a close, needs the organization of tomorrow. It's not just about the brand. It's about an organization that thinks of itself in new ways and thinks of its engagement with people in a new way. And the organization of tomorrow needs a new mental model of business, because the moment you think of business as something that is a little island, that is detached from the world, that has the option of engaging with the world, where you can do consumer visits once in a while, where you do market visits, where you observe consumers through a glass, as if there was some kind of, little bacteria floating around on a petri dish, which is what, research tends to do. You're watching them, oh, they said this. They're like you. How can you convert consumers into pathogen of some kind and observe them, as if they were that? It requires, therefore, a new way of engaging with the world. And in a larger sense, therefore, it is the importance of reintegrating market with society. As has been pointed out by most wonderfully by, say, Rajni Bakshi, she said that if you look at the traditional Indian bazaar, the bazaar was not separate, it was part of community. The bazaar, the people in the bazaar, and therefore they did not do CSR. If they did something for the community, it is because they were part of the community and they saw themselves as that. Somehow business has, in its own mind, one immunity from society. And it is optional that we do our bit, we give a little bit back. You are part of that whole. How can you detach yourself in this mysterious kind of a way? And unless society reintegrates with, and business reintegrates with society, sees itself as that, a lot of the changes that we are talking about are difficult. I'll close with, a line from this beat poet Gary Snyder, who says, and I think it's very useful to remember this wherever we talk about the future. That, one way to, every time we talk about the future, we talk about advancement. And we, in a sense, pat ourselves on the back, and there is the arrogance of the now, to how far we have come, how much we know. And I think what Snyder reminds us is that we are primitives of an unknown culture, of an indeterminate future. And therefore, the wonder that was available to primitives, the curiosity, the humility, the desire to engage in the desire to learn, the desire to evolve, I think is perhaps what is most important in any conversation about the future. Not how far we have come, but how far we have to go and what we do not know, what we need to learn. Thank you very much.